Welcome, Mary Catherine. We want to learn from you. Thank you for joining us. Can we get started by you sharing a bit about your background and what inspires you?
Sure. So my name is Mary Catherine. I am originally from Chicago, Illinois, and I'm 21 years old right now, and I'm just finished my junior year at Harvard. I would say that throughout my life, I've genuinely been most inspired by the people around me and generally doing things that help make the people around me's lives easier. And I think that's really impacted a lot of my work and also driven me to succeed and do the things that I've done in my life.
That's awesome. Uh, you're at Harvard. Uh, when did you decide to go for Ivy League schools, right? When did you decide to go for Harvard?
Yeah, I guess it kind of stems back from when I was 10 years old. Me and my family took a trip to Boston, and I remember we were driving to somewhere else, and we had a small bit of time to stop and see Harvard and look at the campus. We were standing there, and my mom goes, "You know, this is the best university in the country." And when she said that, I just remember thinking, I'm gonna get in here. And so obviously as a 10-year-old, that's a very naive thing to say. And I'm sure a lot of people have that kind of experience. And so, but that was kind of the first time that I thought about it. And then didn't really think about it again until high school. And I really decided, okay, beginning of freshman year, like if I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna go for it. And so I remember telling my guidance counselor at our first meeting that I really wanted to go to Harvard, and she kind of laughed at me because I came from a large public school where people didn't go to Harvard, people didn't go to those types of schools, and so she kind of said, "Honey, like you're gonna have to have really good grades and really good extracurriculars." And I said, "I know, I want to go." And so I think that's kind of the journey of how I set my sights on Harvard, I would say.
That's awesome. So this is a guidance counselor conversation happened during your first year at high school?
Yes.
That's great. So you've been focused on Harvard for a good 8 years before getting into Harvard, and we want to
Mhm.
learn more. So maybe you can help us understand how many colleges did you apply to? Clearly, your goal was Harvard, but how many colleges did you apply to, and how many accepted you?
Yeah. So, I applied to Harvard early and I got in early. So that definitely impacted the number of other schools that I applied to. But besides Harvard, I applied to Yale, Princeton, Brown, Stanford, and Vanderbilt. So five others. And I actually, it was kind of interesting. So I got into Harvard early, and so anything else was a bonus at that point. And then the only other school that I actually got into was Vanderbilt. And I ended up getting the Cornelius Vanderbilt Scholarship, which was a big honor. But it definitely showed me how much of uh, how unpredictable it can be with college admissions, because you would think if you get into Harvard, you can get into some other Ivy. And obviously, I didn't try it for all of them, but it was definitely very interesting. So, yeah.
Got it. No, thanks for sharing that. It is clearly interesting. And you said you got early in Harvard, so that clearly impacted how you did your college selection. But what
Mhm.
criteria did you use, Mary Catherine, to select the colleges to apply to? Clearly, these seem, for a, a standard applicant, all these schools seem like reach schools, right? So, would love to hear your thoughts on how you approach that selection criteria.
Yeah, so I knew that I was going to apply to Harvard early, and I knew that because it was my dream, but I was not expecting to get into Harvard early. I mean, you can't, nobody, no matter how smart you are, can expect to get into a place like Harvard ever. So I made my entire college list, and then after I got into Harvard, ended up shortening it significantly. But essentially, how I thought about it was that all of the Ivies were schools. No matter who you are, an Ivy is a reach school. So, I knew that I wanted to go to a reach school, and I knew that I had all of the minimum kind of requirements to go. And so I knew that I was going to apply to every single Ivy. And obviously, that's kind of a big undertaking, but I knew for myself that I wanted to do that. And that might not be right for other people, because typically the like recommendation is you apply to 3 to 4 reach schools, but that's just how I did it. And then applied to like you know 4 or 5 like target schools. So for me, the target might be some other reach schools. Like a target for me, I felt like was like a USC or a UCLA or even like a Vanderbilt. That was still in the reach category, but it was like more in that kind of area. And then my safety schools, which were a University of Illinois, a couple others like Fordham, and a couple other kind of cool like schools that I liked, but were definitely easier to get into. So that's kind of how I made it. And then obviously once I got into Harvard, I threw away all those target and safety schools and only applied for the reach ones.
Got it. So you had a clear plan, and then of course the Harvard admission changed it, which makes sense.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
in terms of just learning about colleges, I mean, clearly you put a list together. It is a robust list. It's spread all over US, right? So how did you go about learning about colleges and understanding more about the colleges and then deciding this is the college I want to apply to?
Yeah. Um, well, I think it was a little bit more difficult for me because it was during COVID, and during that time period, I got in December of 2020. So I was very much like I couldn't go and visit any of these colleges. So that was certainly a little bit of a restriction. And so I basically tried to get as much information as I could online. So I looked at, Reddit and other like pages where people can kind of just talk about the school like in an unedited way and try to get a sense for what it is like there. I would watch YouTube videos of people kind of vlogging a day in their life. And obviously that's not going to give you like a full understanding of what your own personal experience is going to be, but it certainly gives you a better understanding than if you're just looking at an admissions kind of website because they're only highlighting the good parts. So I think the key is trying to find like real students. And nowadays it's almost easier than ever with things like TikTok and a lot of creators posting about their experiences. Find real people because they're more likely to talk about their actual experience and not sugarcoat it. And that's what you need when you're looking at these colleges. And I also think it's super important to just take into account really basic characteristics like, what size school do you want? Where do you want it to be located? I think that can really, if you actually think about it, like, do I want to be in a place that's warm all the time or that has seasons? That's a really good way to kind of cut out some schools. But for me, I found that I was mostly just focused on kind of the prestige of the school, which maybe isn't the best thing to say, but I was very interested in getting into at least a somewhat prestigious school. And so to me, I didn't care where it was located, I didn't care what size it was, and that's just what I prioritize. So it really just depends on what you want and what you want to prioritize, and there's no wrong answer.
Got it. And then within that pool of schools, how did you decide your strategy on early action, early decision?
Yeah, it was kind of hard because it wasn't just like, oh, I'm just going to apply to Harvard early. It was a decision making process because I knew that by giving like for early action or early decision, you can only apply to one school typically. There's some, rules with that, but it's one school. And so if you're applying to one school, you're giving up an opportunity to apply to another school. So I was thinking, why would I apply to Harvard if I could apply to like a Vanderbilt or like something in that range that the early admission kind of admission rate bump that, it's always easier, or at least there's a higher admission rate for early rather than regular, then that bump will really benefit me and I will probably get in versus something like Harvard, which just feels like a, shot in the dark. And so it was definitely hard for me to decide to kind of throw away that shot on Harvard, knowing that there's, I thought there was no way I was going to get in. I knew I was qualified, but it's Harvard, right? But I guess my thinking and why I ended up making that decision was that if I didn't try, I probably would regret it for the rest of my life. Like I would have rather tried and failed than tried, got into a match school, got rejected from Harvard regular, and always wonder if maybe if I had gone early, would I have gotten in? I didn't want to have that regret. I wanted to kind of live with bravery and with some conviction and try to kind of shoot for the stars. So that really was how I made my decision. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. In terms of once you have picked the schools, did that influence who you're going to pick for your recommenders? Right? What
Mm.
were you looking your recommenders to highlight from your personality trait that you felt would help you get admitted to these schools, or did you not connect the two?
Yeah, I definitely with recommendations, it was definitely a process for me to figure out who to ask, who was going to be the best recommender, because honestly, just because you have a really good relationship with a teacher or a mentor doesn't necessarily mean they're going to write you the best recommendation possible. And it might not even be their fault. They might be really, really trying. But for example, if you have a scientist who's your mentor, they might not be as good at writing, prose in a beautiful way and really telling your story. And so you really just have to understand you're looking for the result, and you want to see who is going to give me the best result, not who do I feel closest to necessarily. So, I was lucky to have a lot of teachers that I really liked and really respected and who I knew liked me. But I ended up going with one of my English teachers because I knew that she was a great writer and that she would represent me well. And then I ended up going with my math teacher from sophomore year, which is not actually typical. Typically, you want a junior or a senior year teacher, but I took math and kind of ran out of classes. I was accelerated after sophomore year. So I didn't take any math junior or senior year because I had already done all of the math that my school offered. So I ended up asking my sophomore year math teacher. And that was a person who I was kind of nervous to ask her because I really struggled in that math class. It was BC calculus. I was a sophomore, the only sophomore. And I came in for help every single day. I would cry over that class. And so it wasn't like I was necessarily the best student in that class. And so I was really nervous about asking her, but I knew that she liked me as a person. I knew that she was a kind person. And I knew that she could tell the story of how I struggled and maybe didn't do as well, but continued to put in the work and eventually got an A in the class and a 5 on the BC Calculus AP exam. And so that was really my decision making while doing that. It's basically you wanted somebody who's going to highlight some of your best characteristics. And I know for myself that one of my best characteristics is my tenacity and the fact that I never give up. And so that was important to me that she wrote that. And I think that went well. And then as opposed to my other kind of extra recommenders, for Harvard specifically, I think you could send in 4 total. So I had my 2 teachers, which I sent into every school. And then I chose my high school principal because I had worked with him on a project and I kind of thought that it's always good to have a principal be speaking for a student. That's obviously a plus. And then the second person was actually a Harvard alumni. So I did this very, very kind of I obviously thought a lot about this when applying to Harvard and going to have a Harvard alumni or try to make some connection between me and Harvard. And I had just gotten connected to this Harvard alumni actually through a conference I did. And to be completely honest, he did not know me very well. He was kind of one of the people in charge of running the conference. I ended up getting an award at that conference. And so kind of just asked him, and he maybe didn't write, because I saw the recommendation letter. It was very nice, but it maybe wasn't the best recommendation letter I could have possibly received. But for me, that wasn't as important as just making that connection for the Harvard admissions committee. Oh, look, see, she's, she comes from a place where nobody goes to Harvard. She doesn't know it, but see, she's made a connection and she can kind of get tapped into this community before even attending. So I wanted to show that.
That's such a great answer. I mean, clearly you thought a lot about that because that's one of the most overlooked aspects of applications. Who to ask for recommendations and what they should be highlighting. You mentioned a couple of times you did well, you felt you were well qualified for Harvard. Perhaps you could share, just so that we understand, ACT, SAT scores, your class rank, GPA, just so that we have a good sense of your hard statistics.
Yeah, sure. So GPA, I had a 4.0 unweighted and then a 4.6 weighted. So that was with AP classes and those types of classes. And then I took the SAT. And so the first time I took it, this was during COVID. So it was actually a struggle just to get into an SAT. It was like, I only had 2 chances to take it before I had to submit. And it was, in such a way that they were one weekend and then the next weekend. So I couldn't see my score for the first one before taking the second one. But obviously I wanted to give myself at least more than one chance. So the first time I took it, I got a 1510. The second time I took it, I got a 1550. So I sent in my 1550 score.
Got it. And what about the class rank? Did you guys have class rank?
We didn't have class rank, but I would have been, I don't know exactly if I would have been first, but definitely in the top 5 of my class. And it would have been by a 0.1 or something like that. Yeah.
So you clearly were very strong on paper. right? Without all the aspects of your personality and your recommendation, on paper, your qualifications were clearly a good fit for Harvard. Uh,
Yes.
and you mentioned SAT, right? You mentioned giving it twice a week apart. That's incredible. What recommendation would you have for folks who are preparing for SAT? Clearly, there are lots of folks who are going into their senior year. They are actually taking SAT right now, right? What would you recommend if you could go back and give yourself advice? How would you recommend to prepare for SAT? And frankly, the other aspect is, how many times would you recommend folks think about taking it?
Yeah. With the SAT, I really do truly believe that if you're the type of student who's interested in going to college first and foremost and, does pretty well in school, you can ace the SAT. It's really not. I know I'm saying this as somebody who got a very good score, but I think most of the difficulty is in really figuring out what the test is and what they're asking for in these questions and kind of how they structure the question. So I am the biggest proponent for practice, practice, practice. The more tests you take, the more practice tests you take, the better you are going to do. And I will say, like, so my AirPod just fell out. So for prep for the SAT, I initially first bought a book, and then I was actually lucky enough, and I'm the first to admit this, that my parents really believe in education, and my mom really wanted me to do well in the SAT, and so she signed me up for like an SAT class. And it's a little bit expensive, and we couldn't really afford it, but my mom really wanted to prioritize it, so I'm very grateful for that. And I remember going into that first diagnostic meeting where they basically have you sit down and take the test to see where your starting point is. And I remember I was a little bit distracted. I was meeting my friends after. I kind of was just not in a good headspace. But I was like, yeah, this is fine. I'm doing this, whatever. And I think I got something like a 1370 or something like that. And I remember them coming into the meeting with my mom after and being like, okay, she wants to go to a really good school, but we don't know if the score is, it's really, yeah, we can bring it up like probably 500 points, but it's really hard to bring that up, to above a 1500. And I remember like feeling so demoralized, knowing that wasn't true, knowing that wasn't my potential at all. But it really did like kind of spur me on. So I just kind of would sit down in my room and do the book and take tests and practice and figure out what the different sections were, so I wasn't thrown off on the day of. And then just like practice, practice, practice literally makes all the difference. And then when I went in for that, first thing and got a 1510, and it was only a couple months after that 1390, I was like, okay, or when I took it, I didn't know my score, but I was like, okay, I think that I've got this. So it definitely don't like think as a student out there that it's, oh, I think I only got a 1390, or it's a good score, but I got a 1390. I can't ever get up to above 1500. Don't ever think that, because the second you think that, that's what's going to happen. Like, I think the most important thing for students to understand is that in order to succeed and become the best version of yourself, you have to believe and have that growth mindset that you can get better. And that's the first step. So I think it's really important to obviously just study a lot and do your best, but also, decide which test is best for you. Sometimes the ACT test, sometimes that makes more sense to people. The ACT can be a little bit more forgiving with the scores because there's less scores, on the spectrum. And so you could get like a 1380, but that might translate to a 34 on the ACT, which is a great score. So just figure out which test is best for you, really focus on it and practice and invest in yourself, and you'll be able to get a score good enough to get into whatever college you want.
Yeah, no, great advice. I would love to hear your perspective on these standardized tests. I mean, clearly you went through the COVID phase. So we went from SATs, ACT are required, to them being optional, to some schools going back to them being required. Of of this, where do you fall, right? Do you think SAT standardized tests are important, or do you feel like we could do without them?
Yeah, this is such an interesting debate. I mean, I am just not a fan of like the standardization of the school system in general. As somebody who, you know, goes to one of the best schools in the country, I find that my brain sometimes works differently than the way that they're trying to teach us and the way that they're trying to test us. And it can be very frustrating to feel as though you're not being judged on the best of your abilities because of the standardization. So in general, I don't really love that aspect of it. However, I do understand that for college, something like the SAT or an ACT is used by colleges as, another mark. And how I've heard it described is that, if you have a 4.0 GPA, that can mean different things at different high schools across the country. And I know this firsthand. To be completely honest, high school getting a 4.0 was very easy, but that's also because I went to an easier high school, not as competitive, But if you go to, for example, one of the best high schools in the country, Thomas Jefferson, etc., it's going to be really hard to get a 4.0. And so colleges are trying to basically, understand who you are. And if they weight GPAs the same and don't take into account these differences, that can really hurt a student who might be extremely smart, gets a 3.8, but is way smarter and more accomplished than somebody who gets a 4.0 at another school. So the standardization really helps colleges understand, you're taking the same test as this kid who's in DC and who's in California. And so it can really allow them to see the differences. So I understand that it's important, and I understand why colleges are bringing it back. But I also think it's really important to stress that it's not the end all be all. Do your best, then don't worry about it.
No, thank you. Well put. Shifting gears to extracurriculars, another very important aspect of applications. Could you share your strategy for extracurriculars? And specifically, because when we talk to the students, the debate is between should I go deep on few or should I go broad to show my just the breadth of things that I'm involved in? Where do you fall on that debate?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I would argue that the key to getting into these colleges is to do both. And I think that's, if I'm going to be completely honest, my extracurriculars, I believe, my extracurriculars and recommendations are the reason I got into Harvard. And so I was very, very broad. I did sports, I did show choir, I did science competitions. I was so broad across so many different levels, but I was also really, really good at a few of those, not all of them, but a few of those, and was able to kind of get some national recognition for a few of them. And I think that's the key. And obviously it's not easy. Like no one's saying that's easy, but if you're kind of debating between being like all around or being really deep, I guess the answer is it really depends on you and who you are. They do take people that are really broad. They take people that are really deep. They love people who are both. So it's really more of figuring out what your strengths are and playing to those, not trying to become somebody else. If you're not really deep in anything and it seems really tough to get really deep in whatever, then try to go broad, like do your strengths. And that's the best that you can possibly do.
That's a great take. And you mentioned awards. What's your take on awards? Because there's an aspect of doing an extracurricular for the enjoyment of the activity. There's the aspect of being recognized for it. And then there is an aspect of external validation of what you have done, right? So how important have you perceived awards to be from an application point of view?
That's a good question. I mean, I think they're pretty important in the sense that if you are trying to get into this like Harvard, Yale, blah, 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 they want kids that are really like something, some kind of recognition or some kind of like they're the top, like they always describe it as like they want kids that are the top in the nation, right? That's what these schools are. They're the top in the nation. So I think the awards are kind of just a signal to them. If you get first place in a national competition, okay, let's take a closer look, right? So I think they are important. And I think that I would be doing the application process a disservice if I said they weren't. However, I really do want to clarify that, and this kind of sounds like a throwaway statement, but it's not, that they are really looking for whole people. Like, and I'm not kidding, they want people who are really have a sense of self and know who they are and have a good personality and have hobbies that they enjoy and bring joy to other people. They don't want some robot who is just like, award, award, award. So I think it's really important to first and foremost just keep sight of what makes you happy. What do you like doing? Maybe how can you elevate that? If you already enjoy doing something, how can you get an award in it just to show the colleges that you're good at it or that you really like it, right? So it's just a signal, but unfortunately, if you see it from the admissions committee's perspective, that's all they have to go on. They don't know you. So it's difficult, but it is, I think, very necessary, or at least I understand why they judge based on it.
Got it. And you mentioned going deep on a couple of extracurricular activities. Would love to understand the definition of deep in this context, because in some cases, having a leadership role is considered deep, right? Would love to get your take on how does leadership fit in and what are other ways of defining deep?
Yeah, I define deep personally as you being in a position or knowing information that other people around you don't have or don't know. So if that's like a leadership position, that's deep because you're a leader. Everybody else isn't a leader. You're leading the group. So that's a deep. If you're really into science, you're into molecular biology or something like that, and you know more about molecular biology than basically anybody around you, that's deep. So that's kind of how I define it. Basically uniqueness. And so, I think I had both the leadership roles and the kind of knowledge. I think I had both sides of those with different things that I did. And so that's kind of how I define it. Did that answer your question?
It does. Great answer.
Okay.
And thank you. Pivoting to application essays, a favorite topic of every applicant, right? How did you pick a topic? Clearly, you were involved in a number of things, right? Distilling down to a topic and then the aspect of that topic you want to highlight. How did you pick that? And then what was your approach to writing?
Yeah, this was honestly one of the toughest parts of my application just because it's so open-ended and broad and you just feel so much pressure. I'll be the first to say I don't think my essay was the strongest part of my application at all. I think it was good enough, but some people get in because of their essay. I don't think I was one of those people. So when I first kind of thought about the college, I first thought about the essay, I would say beginning of August. So I remember that the application deadline for Harvard was on Halloween, like October 31st. So I started in August and I started by just like writing out interesting things about myself. And this is just one approach. I know so many people who have picked a random topic and then kind of talked about elephants and then weave their life in that. I just kind of figured that I would just try to figure out what about me is unique from other people. Let's just list that down. And so then I did a couple of starts and I would just like the best thing you can do with the essay is just start writing, like just word vomit. Get something down on the page and then you can kind of go back and be like, no, that was bad, like that was good, like, and kind of edit. Just start. Don't get paralysis because that's the worst thing you can do. So I wrote about a couple different topics and kind of one of the things on that list that I wrote was my name because my name is Mary Catherine Hanafee Laplante. That's 2 first names, 2 last names, no middle name. And it's just my entire life, it's just like a weird name. So I'd written it down on the list as something that was unique about me. And I kind of came to it and I was like, it would be kind of cool to write about my name and different experiences I've had with just holding this name in my life and kind of create and relate that to who I am as a person. So for example, I wrote about how my name is too, like, it didn't fit into the SAT standardized boxes. It's too long. And so this is kind of cheesy, but like, I don't fit into the boxes, but I went more in depth on that. And that wasn't my entire thing. And then also how my name kind of broke down a lot of people's barriers because I would walk into a doctor's office and say my name and the woman taking it down would be like, wait, what? And kind of ask for the entire story. And there's kind of a cool backstory to why I was named that that's related to my family. So it felt like a really interesting topic and kind of deeper than what meets the eyes. And I could go into a lot of different topics and talk about my family, talk about myself, talk about my experience growing up, and bring it all back in this really tight metaphor of my name. And so I think that it kind of worked out well, and I happened to have this thing about me that was kind of interesting and I could write about. And every person has that. You just have to figure it out, and it might not be as glaringly obvious as your literal name, but
Nice, cool story. So it took you 3 months from start to submission. Would you recommend that? Right? Is 3 months
I
long enough?
for me, I don't love writing, so it was just definitely like a struggle for me. But I think, yeah, at least give yourself 3 months though. Like, just even, you don't have to work on it every day or anything like that, but you need to let it sit. You need to let it sit for a week and come back and read it again. Like, you need time. And so I think that's really important. And this is my Common App, obviously. For my supplemental essays, I wrote those in like a month before, or even for Harvard, I wrote those a month before. And then for the other schools, I kind of reused old essays or wrote them like a week before. It wasn't as important to me, but the Common App I felt was really important.
Got it. Got it. And interviews. Did you get invited for interviews? And if you did, how did you prepare for those interviews?
Yeah, so I was invited to interview for Harvard, and then later I was invited to interview for all of the schools that I applied to. And so I think I was very nervous for the Harvard interview specifically, and it was over Zoom. And I had written down a couple of topics that I wanted to talk about and that I felt like, could really highlight my accomplishments. But I also think it's really important with these interviews to try to just let the conversation flow as naturally as you can. See the interviewer as a person, because typically the best interviews are just a conversation between two people, and the interviewer just likes you as a person. Like, that's really what they're looking for. They're looking for personality. They know what you've done. They have your application. They want to see you, how you interact with somebody, how you make conversation. What do you talk about? Would I want this person to be my roommate at college? Like, that's the type of thing that they're looking for. And so don't be afraid to, like, if you're somebody who's kind of funny naturally, don't be afraid to be funny and talk about something that isn't related to school with the interviewer if they kind of lead you in that direction, or if there's like, just don't stress as much about it. Just have a really good conversation. And that's all of my friends who I have here at Harvard have all kind of described their interviews as just really good conversations. But I was really nervous, and I think the interview was awesome. The interview, I've read my application notes and stuff like that because they have that information for us on file. The interview for me, they liked my application, and so they said, the interview is just to confirm that, she is who she seems to be, and if so, then, looks like she'd be a good person. So it was kind of more of like a check-in, not so much anything that really determined the outcome of my application.
Got it. Got it. That's really good advice. Be yourself. Don't 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 make it
Very generic, but it's true. Yeah.
No, it's not generic. I think a lot of folks want to impress, and then they really try and be who they think the interviewer wants them to be, and that's a
Yeah.
hard ask. So, Mary Catherine, one of the things that's been amazing about this conversation is you are good at school. You did great with SAT. You had lots of extracurricular activities. How did you balance all of those activities? I mean, clearly, high school is a time when you have to do so many things and also apply. What was your trick? How did you balance everything?
Yeah. Sometimes I ask myself that question because I think coming to college and having a little bit of a slower routine where you're not, up doing 8 classes a day has really slowed me down in a good way, I think. And I sometimes look back at high school like, God, how did I do all of that? But I think it really came down to, first and foremost, I liked it. And I think that's kind of the key. Obviously there were things that were hard and I was tired a lot, but I loved being busy. I loved doing cool things. I liked feeling as though I was going somewhere and like I was working hard and trying to achieve my goals. So I liked it. And that makes all the difference to try to push through in those hard times. But in terms of the actual like time balancing act, I think it was challenging. And I'm not gonna say like I was perfect at it. I think that things definitely got dropped. I think I was holding too many plates. And there were things that I was doing, things that I even put on my college application that I wasn't perhaps putting as much effort into as I should have been. And it wasn't as successful as it could have been because of it. And that's just a reality. I was doing the best that I could. So things will get dropped. I think that one thing that really helped me was not wasting time on like partying, or doing anything like that. And I know that that's pretty typical advice, like, don't go out, don't drink or do drugs, obviously. But I really do think that being in high school, like, if you're really focused, you can't, it's just a time waster. It's really not good. And so I think that that was first and foremost, maybe the key to like being able to balance everything, was the fact that that wasn't a part of my life. I did really prioritize, friends and making time for friends, but I made sure that they were the right kind of people. People who were also ambitious, like people who would, come study with me or do things like that, to spend time together while working towards things. So I honestly, it's hard for me to give advice on this because, and this is just the reality of being a human. I don't know if I could do what I did back then right now. So, but I think that I was in a particular time in my life where I was just really, on it. And I will say though, I got very sick. Like I barely slept. I would get sick like every week with like a cold or something like that. Like my immune system was just really bogged down. So it's honestly not something I recommend. And I do know a lot of people who get into these schools without doing that. So I think first and foremost, like taking care of yourself, exercising is actually super helpful. I find that exercising just clears your brain, allows you to do more at a time, allows you to focus more. So if you're, in high school, even getting like an hour of exercise a day in whatever form, that's not a time waster. That's going to make you more efficient in the rest of your time that you have. So that's one concrete thing that I can say really helped.
That's great advice. So just stepping back, now that you have gone through the application process, the admission process, you got admitted to Harvard, you are at Harvard, but then you also got rejected from some schools, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did you, clearly you had Harvard who admitted you early, so the rejections probably stung less, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, how did you mentally handle rejection?
Yeah, super hard. And it definitely did. Like, I'm very grateful that I got into Harvard early because I genuinely don't know what I would have done if I had just gotten rejected from these schools. Which is kind of unhealthy when I think about it, but definitely just the reality. I think that the one that really hit me the hardest was Stanford, because the other colleges I was like, no, I go to Harvard over, but Stanford, I was definitely like, if it's between Stanford and Harvard, I might choose Stanford. And so I think that it was just kind of, it really made me detach myself a little bit from the college admissions process, which I think was actually really helpful. I think being able to pull yourself out and understand that you are your own person. It's just a stupid process, filled with fickle human beings just like yourself that kind of have biases and pick people for whatever reason they pick people. And that it really is so much less personal than it feels. I think that that's kind of that rationalization, I suppose, was what really helped me through it. But it was definitely like, I was definitely disappointed for a few days. Obviously, I'm very lucky I had the acceptance letter from Harvard to cushion that disappointment. But I think just being able to detach yourself is really important.
Great advice. How much do you think luck plays a role in admission process?
I think it plays a huge role, like genuinely. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the stats. I'm sure everybody's heard these stats that they have, I don't know, 20,000 valedictorians applying to Harvard. Like, it's insane. Everybody who applies to a Harvard or Yale or Stanford is somebody who thinks they could get in, right? Like, so it's the applicant pool is insane. So I do think it just depends. Like, do you strike this, this person who's reading your application? Like, maybe if my application had gone to this person instead of this person wouldn't like it as much as this person. It literally is so dependent. And it also is based upon a lot of different factors that are completely out of your control. I mean, obviously, we don't have affirmative action anymore, things like that, but things like where you're from, what instrument you play. Like, for example, maybe they need a clarinet player and you play the oboe. tough luck. Like, it's just, it's so, there's so many other factors at play that I actually think it's silly when somebody's like, um, or I think it's silly to say that you're not qualified, or like, they didn't like me as a person because I didn't get in. It probably 90% chance that it was some kind of factor completely out of your control. So yeah, I think it plays a huge, huge part of the process.
Thank you. I think that's important to keep in perspective. Now
Mhm.
that you've been at Harvard for 3 years, um, what do you think are the key traits and experiences that a school like Harvard looks for in an applicant? Who have you seen succeed at Harvard? Um, who are your classmates who basically came after you? Uh, if you just have to basically boil it down, key traits and experiences.
Mhm. I think, well, first of all, I'll say I've been very surprised by the wide diversity of people and personalities that I've met. Like, it's definitely, I cannot say like, oh, this personality, like type A is the only person that gets into Harvard. Not true. So I think that that's one thing, is that it's so diverse. But I think that the base things, characteristics, traits they look for, and these are all 100% within your control. An underlying curiosity, because you have to be curious about the world. You have to ask questions in order to succeed, in order to understand things better. So ask more questions, like genuinely, this will help you. Ask more questions, get to know more people, ask people about themselves, be more curious. That's going to instantly make you, especially in your interview, a much, much better applicant. They want people who are willing to learn from the people around them. And they also want people who are interesting. And that can mean a lot of different things, but they want to, if I'm talking to somebody, my classmate, they want us both to be interested in each other and to find the other kind of compelling as a person. And so, doing different hobbies, having different ways of thinking, or, just being, the third one, and being unafraid to talk about your opinion, and being unafraid to voice your concerns, and also to advocate for yourself. So, to kind of break this down, creativity, being interesting or compelling, and basically, I would describe it as having self respect, because when you have self-respect, you're going to speak up for yourself, you're going to speak up for others, you're going to try to get into rooms that you think you should be in, you're going to try to succeed because you respect yourself and you respect your life, and you try to take care of yourself. And so I think those three characteristics are the most common ones that I've found in people who go here, much more so than, I mean, obviously everybody's smart, but I think it's much more important than raw intelligence, or even like raw, I don't know, physical talent if you're an athlete or something like that.
That's a great answer, Mary Catherine. Thank you. You aimed for Harvard when you were 10 years old. It took you 8 years to get there. Now, you clearly had a perspective of what you would get when arriving at Harvard. Uh, Based on your experiences, what have you enjoyed most?
I think the thing I've enjoyed most at Harvard has been the connections that it gives me, the street cred it gives me, I would say. And that might sound shallow, but it's actually so important, unfortunately, for getting jobs, getting interviews, even just today, I'll give an example. I was kind of sourcing for different companies that I might want to work with. And I literally walked into a building in downtown Boston today with a doorman. Said I was from Harvard. He buzzed me right up. Like that type of thing. And obviously you have to use it in the right way. You don't, it's not just going to automatically open doors. You have to work really hard. But it's just unfathomable, and I still don't understand it, but it's a benefit that I'll greatly take advantage of. Um, so I think that's the first thing that most surprised me and has been probably one of the biggest benefits. And then the second one has been the network, for sure. Just the people you meet are also interesting. And it's really a cool feeling to know that every single year you have the opportunity to, make new friends with really cool people. And you know that every single person you meet is going to be interesting in some way. And that's really, it's a very unique experience. I don't think many people get to experience that in their lifetime, of having that big of a pool of people around you who are all just like so incredibly interesting. And so that's completely priceless.
That's awesome. Mary Catherine, we created Good Goblin to help college applicants. Would love to get your take on what we're doing here at Good Goblin.
Yeah, I think it's really great because, I know that when I was going through the application process, I was desperate for people who had gone through it to kind of talk about their experience, and a lot of times once you get into college, you don't really talk about the application process ever again, you kind of move on with your life, and so I think it's a really good opportunity to kind of bring people like me back to talk about our experience in hindsight and hopefully give some advice, give some frameworks for thought that might be really helpful, and hopefully kind of make that process a little bit smoother for people who are going through it. And I've been there. I know how difficult it is, and so I think that it's a great tool for people to use.
Awesome. Mary Catherine, thank you so much for taking the time. It was a pleasure learning from you.
Thank you so much.